To stay in the 60s and remain overcast for us out here. And when we conduct tours, we always look for shade, and obviously there's absolutely none here in Saunders Field. I still have some of the handouts, maps left if anybody needs them.
Anybody else in the crowd?
All right, let's get started here with our essentially our second stop. We are standing obviously in the middle of Saunders Field, and if we were here 150 years ago, right now, the Battle of the Wilderness would be opening right at our feet. This is where the Battle of the Wilderness began. This is where the Overland Campaign, which ran from the wilderness here down through Spotsylvania Courthouse, the North Anna River, Cold Harbor, and then on across the James River to Petersburg. And it all began right here, May 5th, 150 years ago, right now, right where we're standing. Andy had mentioned and talked about the strategy of the Union Army. If you look at the map that you all have, hopefully, the page or the side that has the two maps on it, at the top, Advance on the Wilderness, May 4th, 1864. In understanding U.S. Grant and George Meade's plans for the wilderness, if you look on the map, you'll see Meade in large letters toward the top near Brandy Station and Culpeper Courthouse. Down to the south, if you follow that dashed sort of line that indicates the Orange and Alexandria Railroad, it crosses the Rapidan River and then runs through Orange Courthouse. So Orange Courthouse represents where Robert E. Lee and essentially his army were positioned. And so Meade is at the Union Army of the Potomac at Culpeper Courthouse. Lee is at Orange Courthouse. The Rapidan River flows between them. That is the barrier between the armies in the spring of 1864. Now, U.S. Grant has directed George Meade to make an attack. He is to bring Robert E. Lee to battle. That is the plan for the Army of the Potomac. There are many options, or there are a few options here on how to bring that about. They can either move to the left, which is move to the east, and try to get around Lee to the east, to Lee's right, essentially, as he's facing north, or they can go around to the west. And there are pluses and minuses with both. Going around to the west could be potentially advantageous. Moving to the right, and that is around Lee's left, to the west, could be advantageous because the previous November of 1863, there was the non-battle of Mine Run that occurred just a few miles down the road here. The armies had faced one another, but the Confederates had built such strong defenses, earthworks and trenches, that essentially the Union Army chose not to make a major attack. Those earthworks in May of 1864 were still there. Still daunting, still intimidating for the Union Army of the Potomac. Lee's earthworks were still there along Mine Run. So by moving west, to the west of Orange Courthouse and crossing there, they might be able to get around and keep Lee from possibly using those defenses a second time. Going west also had its problems because you ended up running into more rivers and more crossings, so it became a little difficult logistically. Moving to the east would be moving through Spotsylvania County, where we are, into Orange County, just to our west. Actually, we're in Orange County now. Moving through Spotsylvania into Orange County would become a problem, could become a problem, because again, you have Mine Run and those Confederate defenses that you might encounter. You chose not to attack those in November. What would be different in May of 1864? But it was advantageous from the standpoint of supply. Grant, as Andy said, understood this was not going to be one battle and that's it. Grant understood and in fact informed the Lincoln administration. He said he expected a long, hard, desperate fight with Robert E. Lee in Virginia. And so he made plans that he would continue, if fortunes did not go his way, to continue moving south. And he had expected to link up with Benjamin Butler at some point down around Richmond or Petersburg. So Grant was already planning for the future. His idea, he's in this. All chips are in. It's not going to be one battle, and that's it. He knows he's not going to be able to take Lee down in that fashion. So by moving east, he can continue to use supply lines along the rivers. The Rappahannock River flowing through Fredericksburg, the rail line that ran from the Potomac River down through Fredericksburg, continuing to move east, shortened his supply line from Washington. And that was the decision that was made. They would move to the east and around Lee and turn and head west and drive toward Lee's position at Orange Courthouse. The plan was actually developed by George Meade's chief of staff, Andrew Humphreys. He devised the plan. And his plan was that the Union Army 5th, 6th, and 9th Corps would cross the Rapidan River at Germanna Ford, just a few miles off to our north and west. The 2nd Army Corps would cross at Ely's Ford, which was above the Chancellorsville battlefield. The 5th, 6th, and 9th Corps would cross at Germanna. They would hit the Orange Turnpike, and Route 20 here, right in front of us, is the Orange Turnpike. Ran from Fredericksburg all the way out to Orange Courthouse, which was where Robert E. Lee's army was. The 5th and 6th and 9th Corps would utilize the Orange Turnpike, eventually driving down to the Orange Plank Road to the south. The Union 2nd Corps would continue down to the Catharpin Road, which was farther to the south. And you can see those roads and the arrows on the map that says Into the Wilderness, May 5th, 1864 at the bottom. Those are the 3 roads the Union Army was planning to take. The reason for that was driving west along Orange Turnpike and Orange Plank Road to the south could bring Lee to battle and perhaps pin him in. If they get through the wilderness, this dense 70 square miles of forest that covers western Spotsylvania and eastern Orange County, if they get through the wilderness and they run into Lee inside his entrenchments at Mine Run, the Catharpin Road to the south will swing below Lee's entrenchments. So the Union 2nd Corps will get below and flank them. In other words, get around the right flank or the right end of the Confederate Army. So that's their plan. Bring Lee to battle, pin him in. And as Andy said, Meade understood that the Mine Run trenches were out here. So the idea of not necessarily getting stuck in the wilderness and fighting in these dense woods, because it negates your numbers potentially and your ability to use artillery, because you can only fire at what you can see, and in the woods you can't see very far. Getting out of the wilderness, good, except for you have to deal with Mine Run. So perhaps fighting in this area may not necessarily be a bad thing compared to the trenches that Meade faced at Mine Run in November of '63. So that was the plan. And the Union Army did get moving. As Andy said, midnight, May 3rd, they're on the move. And they're crossing the rivers, or the Rapidan River. They're crossing at Ely's Ford above Chancellorsville. They're crossing at the Germanna Ford off to our north and west. And on May 4th, the Union Army, or the Union 5th Corps, the 5th Army Corps under Gouverneur K. Warren, had reached Wilderness Tavern. It's just a couple miles off to our east here. And if you look at the map that says Into the Wilderness, May 5th, 1864, up in the upper right-hand corner, you see the name Warren, Lacey, Wilderness Tavern. That was where the Union Army 5th Corps under Gouverneur Warren had reached on May 4th, 1864. The hope was to continue to push through. However, that evening, because of the not moving as quickly as had been anticipated, the Union 5th Corps encamped on the evening of May 4th around Wilderness Tavern, around Elwood, for those of you who have been to those 2 locations on the Wilderness battlefield off to our east. The Union 6th Corps, they were camped along the Germanna Plank Road. For those of you who've been driving through the area, that is today's State Route 3 as it comes across the Rapidan River and converges up here at the intersection. A 6th Corps was strung out along the Germanna Plank Road, and the 2nd Union Army Corps camped on the Chancellorsville battlefield that evening of May 4th. There were cavalry or horsemen. The horsemen, their purpose at this point is to go out in advance of the Union Army. find out in the direction that we were heading, the Army is heading, what can you find? What is out there before the Army continues down the road? And on the evening of May 4th, there was Union cavalry that had come down the Orange Turnpike here and headed west a couple miles to Robinson's Tavern. James Wilson, commanding Union Cavalry Division, his first time here in the Army of the Potomac. He was a friend of Grant's and had come east with Grant that spring. Wilson sent cavalry down to Robinson's Tavern. They got there, they didn't really see much Confederate activity. So instead of leaving scouts there to watch the road, they took their cavalry and cut south to the Orange Plank Road. So on the evening of May 4th, the Union 5th Corps, which is back at Wilderness Tavern, fully expects that there is Union cavalry out here. So should danger present itself along this road, they would know. The cavalry would be the early warning system. The problem was there was no cavalry out here on the Orange Turnpike that evening. So the next morning, May 5th, 1864, Gouverneur Warren, commanding the 5th Corps, his plan was to continue south along a road that cut through the wilderness, known as the Parker Store Road, and get down to the Orange Plank Road to the south. That was his role, get down to that road. The Union 6th Corps would be utilizing the Orange Turnpike here as they headed west, the 2nd Corps down on Catharpin Road. That was the plan. Little did they know that morning that just within 2 miles, the Confederate Army was camped down at Robinson's Tavern. Just after the Union cavalry had left the previous night on May 4th and headed south, Richard S. Ewell and his 2nd Corps of the Confederate Army rolled into Robinson's Tavern. In fact, that evening, on the evening of May 4th, some of the 5th Corps pickets, and pickets were men who were stationed far in advance of the Army. Again, another early warning system, a protection, a cordon around the main force. These men, probably just 100 yards or so from where we're standing, were sitting in the woods, keeping an eye on this road. They fully expected cavalry was out in advance because that's how things worked. That's the way they should have worked. But that evening, they were looking down the road and they could see smoke in the distance. The smoke was campfires and they assumed it was the cavalry. The problem was it was 1/3 of Robert E. Lee's army, within 2 miles, and the Union Army didn't know it at that time. So the following morning, 5 a.m. is when the 5th Corps was on the move. Gouverneur Warren was up getting his command. They were moving down the Parker Store Road. Out here on the Orange Turnpike and facing down the road, the last of Warren's divisions to pull out and head south was commanded by Brigadier General Charles Griffin, 38-year-old from Ohio, West Point grad, trained artillerist, but he had led a division of infantry since the Battle of Fredericksburg in December of 1862. He was a hard fighter, he was outspoken, daring, popular with his men. Well, Griffin and his pickets, which were from the 1st Michigan Infantry, they were just finishing their breakfast, packing up their gear, getting ready to pull in, head back to Wilderness Tavern, take up the route of march south, just as the outposts, which were a few men who were strategically placed beyond the pickets, and probably right here on the edge of Saunders Field, those outposts reported Confederates marching down the road from the west. So if you can imagine, on the morning, about 5 a.m., this morning, 150 years ago, these pickets in these woods are looking down the road and they can see Confederate infantry, soldiers marching toward them. Robert E. Lee and Richard Ewell, commanding the Confederate 2nd Corps, were on the way. Now, Ewell, who was advancing from Robinson's Tavern, he had been told by Robert E. Lee to bring the enemy to battle as soon as possible. That's what Lee had told Ewell. When you find them, you bring them to battle immediately. So both Lee and Grant have the exact same plan, and that is aggression. When you find them, hit them. Bring them to battle. Around 6 a.m., Ewell reached the western edge of the field we're standing on, right back there where we parked, where our tent is, where we started. 6 a.m. on the morning of May 5th, Ewell reached the western edge of this field. He paused and he sent back for instructions from Lee. He could see that there were Federals down the road, and so he had reached his objective as far as coming into contact with the Union Army, but now he needed further orders. At this point, Lee told him, hold tight, do not attack. Well, the reason for that is what was transpiring down on the Orange Plank Road to our south. Ambrose Powell Hill, commanding the Confederate 3rd Corps, was coming up the Orange Plank Road, but he was hitting that cavalry. The cavalry that had been up here the previous night and had headed south. And he was driving the cavalry before him. So the Confederate 2nd Corps coming in this direction on the turnpike was outdistancing the Confederates on the plank road to the south. Those two roads, as you can see on your map, parallel one another. And Lee did not want Ewell to outdistance Hill. Keep them together so they can support each other if they run into trouble. So Ewell is told, hold up here on the ridge. That's what he does. Hold tight. His men immediately and instinctively begin to build trenches, dig earthworks. Now, these are not substantial earthworks. These are not, chest high. These are basically piling up felled trees. They weren't building really solid. They were, in the terminology of the time, they were considered hasty earthworks, but some sort of defense. And this is very instructive, because they are learning from Mine Run the previous November. And this is the beginning of this transformation of battlefield tactics that is the Overland Campaign. Going from open field fighting necessarily to entrenched positions. But they began to dig in and construct earthworks on the edge of the field. The field here at the time was about 800 yards in length, east-west, about 400 yards north and south. Its access was on the Orange Turnpike. Its origin's a bit of a mystery. We really don't know exactly who lived here, but it obviously was a farmed field. There were corn stubble, according to the veterans who fought through here, and this is where the battle begins. The 5th Corps Griffin, having reported that the enemy's in his front, Gouverneur Warren suspends his advance south, and he begins to pull his divisions back. Meade had told him, wherever the army or wherever the enemy is, that's where we're going. So Warren and Meade understood, if this is where the Confederates are, we're going to attack. Griffin had pushed some of his men out to investigate, so they're essentially along the edge of the tree line here, looking west across the opening. He chose one of his brigades to head on out and check things out. That was the 18th Massachusetts, the 83rd Pennsylvania. They sent some men forward, and they can plainly see the Confederates. As you can imagine, as we stand here, you can plainly see lights maneuvering up on the ridge in the far distance. And so the skirmishers from the 83rd Pennsylvania, the 18th Massachusetts, some of them moved out into the field. They exchanged fire with the Confederates up on the ridge. 18-year-old Private Charles Wilson of Massachusetts, 18th Massachusetts, shot and killed here in the field. First casualty of the battle, first casualty of the Overland Campaign that morning. Meade and Grant are responding. Meade and Grant want action. 7:15, 2 hours have passed. 1 hour since Warren had suspended his maneuver, and his message had been moving up the chain of command. Meade received Warren's message about Confederates in his front, and at 7:15, after conferring, Meade canceled the day's plans. We're not going to continue heading south. We're heading west. We're going straight for the Confederates. And he told Warren to do that, because at 8 a.m. Grant replied endorsing Meade's aggressiveness, saying, if any opportunity presents itself for pitching into a part of Lee's army, do so without giving time for disposition. What that means is don't take time to organize your attack. Don't necessarily get your line straight. If that's where he is, go after him. Grant, very aggressive. Again, this is something that is going to surely... All right, thank you. Which is surely going to be typical of the campaign itself. Warren took his men and began to array a position, but it's going to take time. I mean, we're talking tens of thousands of men, trying to form them, 20,000 men or so, trying to form them into a position in the woods and the field to attack westward. It's going to take time. And during as those hours tick away, trying to get this organized, Grant and Meade are going to lose their patience with Warren. Well, Warren's only reacting to Charles Griffin. Griffin has been told attack down the road. But he knows when he goes into the woods, because his position, his division extends beyond the width of this field, He doesn't know what's in those woods. Those woods could be filled with Confederates. So to blindly send his men into the woods to be destroyed, Griffin has a problem with that. He wants to know what is around him. He knows the Union 6th Corps is up on the Germanna Plank Road to his north. They're being ordered to head south through a woods road and connect with him, but they're not here yet. He doesn't want to go in until they're here and in position. So Griffin is delaying. That's causing Warren to have to delay. That's getting Meade and Grant extremely, extremely upset. 10:30 a.m., Warren tells his divisions, push forward a heavy line of skirmishers followed by your line of battle and attack the enemy at once and push him. Get out there and do it. That's 10:30. The fighting doesn't open up here until shortly after noon, 1 o'clock. They're taking their time trying to get their positions. Fighting in these woods blind is not something that they want to do. But finally, Grant has had enough. Meade has had enough. Meade says to Warren, or I should say Warren sends a message to Meade saying the 6th Corps was coming up on my right, and that if time would be given them to get into position as soon as they announced this by attacking, I could move my whole force against their front. In other words, as soon as I know the Union 6th Corps is in the woods off to the north, I'll send my men in. Meade's response to Warren, we are waiting for you. So Meade and Grant are getting frustrated. They had ordered an attack as early as 7, 8 o'clock in the morning. Here it is noon. Get moving. All the while the Confederates are preparing a defense up here. So just before noon, Warren had had enough, and he orders Charles Griffin to attack. Griffin arrays his position on either side of the turnpike here in these fields extending north and south, and he's going to send his men across these fields blindly against the Confederate position directly up on the ridge. And so with that, if you'll follow me, we'll head on to our next stop and talk about the opening attack across Saunders Field. What? Got everybody up. All right, so finally the attack is going to occur. After much delay, much frustration from Grant all the way down to Griffin. The stress, the frustration building, the attack orders being given. It needs to be understood that there are more divisions of the Union 5th Corps to our south. They had been working their way south under Samuel Crawford as well as James Wadsworth. They were to link up with Griffin. So essentially, if everything were to work correctly, you would have Griffin's division, about 5,000 to 6,000 men, straddling the Orange Turnpike here. You would have two more divisions off in the woods to the south, and you'd have the 6th Corps coming in from the north, if everything were to work correctly. But nothing really works correctly in the wilderness. Not as immediately or as explicitly designed. Fighting in the woods, the dense woods. In fact, when some of the attacks come forward on the morning or the early afternoon of May 5th, there are accounts of officers using a compass in order to find their way. So the woods today are not nearly as dense as they were in 1864. So if you can imagine trying to maintain a battle line of men standing shoulder to shoulder in what we have today, it was far more dense and forbidding for armies to fight. Thus the reason for fields that become magnets. The fields become magnets, and Saunders Field here is just one. Saunders Field does encompass both sides of the road. On the south side of the road here, we do actually have a relative close tree line and vegetation line to what would have been here in 1864. On the north side, not nearly, the field does not extend nearly as far east as it should. The brick rambler on the other side of the road there is inside Saunders Field. That was purchased by the Civil War Trust, who has in turn sold it to the Park Service. There is a life estate there. The gentleman who lives there will stay there, but at some point in the future, we will perhaps be able to extend the boundaries of the field more to its wartime dimensions. But this is where Griffin's division, for the most part, is going to attack. They do extend into the woods somewhat to the north and south, but they are going to be coming across this field. So, if you turn to your map and flip it over to the back side, and you see the large map that says Saunders Field, May 5th, 1864, that is, at 1 p.m., that is essentially the attack. Well, it is the attack that occurs here, coming across the field, afternoon, 1 o'clock on May 5th, 1864. Again, at the time, 150 years ago, right now, this field is filled with Union soldiers moving across and back and forth across this field. The way it's oriented is we are going, if you have it turned, the orange turnpike's right here, north, sort of off in that direction on the other side of the road, and we are about, I would say, behind where it says, or just to the east of where 44th New York, the large block that says 44th New York. So essentially that's where we're standing right now. Griffin is straddling the turnpike, his division. He has one brigade on the north commanded by a fellow named Romaine Ayres. Ayres is an artillerist, just as Griffin is trained. To the south, you have Joseph Bartlett's brigade, and then in reserve is Schweitzer's brigade. So you have these three brigades that comprise Griffin's division. The men fighting on the north side of the road are unique in the Army of the Potomac to an extent. At this stage of the war, they're wearing Zouave uniforms. Zouave uniforms are very colorful. French colonial troops influenced by them. Baggy pants, wearing a fez, very colorful uniforms. At this stage of the war, 1864, to have such a uniform is a real sense of pride. Not to mention, you obviously stand out. But that's part of it. You are showing your courage, your bravery, by wearing something that is a potential larger target. There are 4 regiments of Zouaves over there. 2 from New York and 2 from Pennsylvania. The 140th New York, 146th New York, 91st Pennsylvania, and the 155th Pennsylvania. Also in that brigade are the U.S. regulars. The U.S. regulars that are still in the Army of the Potomac at this time. These are not the volunteers from the states. These are the United States regular troops, although their men are largely volunteer soldiers who have joined the U.S. regulars. But Ayres' brigade is on the north side, Bartlett's brigade on the south side, and they begin to move down the road. Their plan comes straight across the field and attack the Confederates that are on the far western edge. That is the plan. Attacks are supposed to be occurring to their south in the woods. Hopefully the 6th Corps will show up off to the north. The Confederates had deployed on both sides of the roads themselves. They extended into the woods to the north and south. Griffin had no idea how far. He had no idea where the Union or Confederate line ended or where it began, but he knew where it was, and it was on the ridge on the western side. Artillery. Confederate had guns, cannons, positioned adjacent to the road, firing, sweeping this field, sweeping down the road. This is what Griffin's division was attacking into. Romaine Ayres' brigade, which is on the north side of the road, deploys into 2 different lines. Its left is sitting on the turnpike. They're facing west, so they're from the turnpike extending north. You have the 140th New York and the U.S. regulars in the first line. Backing them up, the 146th New York and the 2 Pennsylvania regiments of Zouaves. And they moved forward at the common time. The common time is a deliberate walk, a march, as they begin to come forward from the woods and stepping out into the field. As they come across the field, they begin to make their first descent and heading down toward the gully in the stream that we can see in front of us. On the north side of the road, a member of the 12th U.S. Infantry, who's making an attack in that initial wave, he described the Confederate fire as it came at him out of the edge of the field. he said, a line of fire began in their front, referring to the Confederates. A line of fire began in their front, but nearly a brigade's length to the left and swept along the edge of the wood, from the wood, touched the turnpike, to and past the brigade front slowly, beautifully, in its machine-like regularity, and lost itself out of sight and by way of sound off in the woods to the right. And what he's saying, very confusing, but what he's saying is the fire begins along the road and begins to sweep across off to the north. Almost this machine-like fire running from the road off into the woods to the north. The Confederates were firing by what was known as fire by file, which was essentially a machine-like precision that sort of sweeps the front, not a massive volley. Every man firing at the same time, but they began to regulate their fire going across, and that's what the regulars and the 140th New York are attacking into. The initial fire is high. The Federals who attacked in Ayer's brigade said that the fire passed over their heads as they came across the field. They pushed down the slope into the ravine in front of us on the other side of the road as it cuts across the field. And as they reach the ravine and begin to make their ascent up the other side, about where our shelter is, our exhibit shelter on the other side of the road and where the parked cars are, as they cross the swale, they pick it up to a double quick. In other words, a deliberate jog. Not a march, but they're now jogging in their formation heading up. As they do so, they begin to break apart. The 140th New York begins to drift to the left and to the south of the field. The U.S. regulars are drifting to the north, and that creates a gap in their line, and that's going to become a problem. The fellow in the 12th U.S. Infantry said, again, just as the line on the run is about to enter the wood on the other side, begins that terrible clockwork fire on the left, and how grim and severe it seems now in its slow, sure movement and awful in its effect. The men fall in groups of 8 and 10, leave great gaps in the line that with a cheer and rush tries to close up as it moves and dashes into the wood out of sight. The Confederates had deployed out of the woods and on the downward slope of the hill leading into Saunder's Field. As Ayer's first line, the 140th New York and the U.S. regulars, are just about to hit them, the Confederates withdraw. And they fall back into the woods and behind the protection of the woods they had cut down, the barricades, the beginnings of their earthworks and trenches. And what that does is it draws the New Yorkers and the U.S. regulars into the woods where they lose cohesion, semblance of a formation. It draws them into the woods. The Confederates are now inside their earthworks, firing from behind protection. The gap had developed in the line, and the New Yorkers push off into the northwest corner of Saunder's Field. The U.S. regulars push off into the northwest corner. The New Yorkers are heading into the woods along the road. As they do so, the Confederates take advantage. They have multiple brigades that are extending the line into the woods, as you can see on your map, and they begin to take advantage of this gap, and they move in between as the Federals push in to the woods. With this gap, the Confederates begin to infiltrate it. The 140th New York, their right flank, or the right end of their line, is taking a pounding. They can't get into the Confederate trenches, and they go to ground. In other words, they drop down in the woods, taking any shelter they can find. The regulars off to the north side, they're in a smoky mess. They enter the woods, the smoke is so intense they can't see where they are, they can't see where they're going. A regular U.S. infantry soldiers refer to it as a weird, uncanny contest, a battle of invisibles with invisibles. So fighting in these smoky, dense woods, they can't see anything. It's at this point that Ayer sends in his second line, send in the reinforcements. 146 New York and the 2 Pennsylvania Zouave regiments. They come trotting across the field as well, taking fire the entire way. The Pennsylvanians rush off to the northwest corner to try and assist the U.S. regulars. The 146th New York tries to plug the gap. They go for that hole in the front line. Also, Griffin is sending in artillery, cannon to assist. 2 guns are going to roll out here, cross the bridge of the ravine, and take a position about down where, in the neighborhood of where we have the gun positioned by the shelter. They're going to take a position that close and begin firing in support of Ayers' brigade up in the woods. Porter Farley, a member of the 140th New York, wrote afterward, he said, "From the bottom of the hollow behind me," so he's up in the woods or on the edge of the field, so from the bottom of the hollow behind him would be down in the ravine. "From the bottom of the hollow behind me, I heard the bang from 2 pieces of artillery and heard their charges cut through the bushes somewhere near me. I jumped back a few steps and saw 2 of our guns with the cannoneers ramming in their charges." Griffin had ordered in 2 guns, 1 section of Battery D of the 1st New York Light Artillery under young Lieutenant William H. Shelton. He had unlimbered the 2 guns after crossing the bridge and to the right of the road, and he was firing diagonally across the field to the support of Ayers' brigade. The problem is he can't see what he's firing at in the woods. And there are a lot of Federals and Confederates mixed in those woods. But the battle was on. What Grant had wanted was bring Lee to battle. Well, the battle is on. Ayers' brigade, Joseph Bartlett's brigade on this side of the road, having come across at 1 o'clock 150 years ago today, had opened the Battle of the Wilderness in the Overland Campaign as far as military actions would go. But while Ayers is fighting and struggling on the north side, Bartlett's brigade on this side of the road that we're standing on is having a little more success. And for that, we're going to move on to our next stop.
Which is about where?
Hanging in there.
Marcy Brown's going to This is old green.
Somebody dropped the pink camera. Pink camera.
50 years ago today, General Joseph Bartlett, who commanded the Federal troops on the southern end of Saunders Field, sent his men across the field, and they would encounter the troops under the command of General John Rum Jones. Jones commanded Virginians, and Bartlett commanded a kind of hodgepodge of Northeasterners. There were men from Massachusetts, there were men from Maine, from New York. It's a whole different group of men. Now, I mentioned the nickname of General Jones is Rum Jones. You might be a little curious about that. He earned this nickname while he was a cadet at West Point, perhaps because of his nickname and his favorite penchant for his favorite pastime of drinking. He graduates towards the bottom of his class, but he did try to redeem himself here on the battlefield. One of the little interesting side notes about him is that it takes him a while to get promoted up to Brigadier General, and when he finally does, General Lee promises President Davis that, quote, should Jones fail in his duty as Brigadier General, he will immediately resign. That's not typically something you find promised to President Davis or to President Lincoln for that matter. So clearly there was a little bit of skepticism about how well Jones could perform on the battlefield. But Jones does stay the course. He staves off Federals to the end, even as his line crumbles because he's outflanked on his right. He refuses to fall back, as many of his men do, and he is going to be shot and instantly killed here on the battlefield on May 5th. Private Theodore Gurish of the 20th Maine gives us a very apt, I think, description of the fighting that was taking place here and how ferocious it was. He wrote, "What a medley of sounds! The incessant roar of the rifle, the screaming bullets, the forest on fire, men cheering, groaning, yelling, swearing, and praying. All this created an experience in the minds of the survivors that we can never forget." Now, it's ironic, I think, that General Jones and his Virginians don't have protection on their right and that they're forced to fall back. The irony there is that, of course, as Eric described, that's what's going on across the battlefield at the federal line. Ultimately, that proves to be the federal troops' undoing, that they are outflanked on their right. But on this end of the battlefield, initially it's going to be the Confederates who are outflanked on the right. And as they begin to fall back, there will be a kind of domino effect, and General Bartlett's men will surge across the field, pursuing them into the woods. But in their zeal, they pursue them a bit too far, and Eric also described the tangle of the wilderness and its thickets, and these men are going to end up in isolated pockets, separated from each other. They find themselves in small groups of men, and in some cases not with a commander, with no regimental colors nearby, and not really sure what to do next. One such story emerges from the 20th Maine, the famed regiment of Gettysburg. And like so many other of these units of Bartlett's, as they surge forward, they get tangled in the woods. They emerge with stories much later about how they managed to fight their way back out. The 20th Maine is under the command of Lieutenant Melcher. They continue to push forward, and they find themselves isolated and not realizing that the enemy is behind them until they begin to take fire from the right to the rear. And as they're taking this fire, initially they think it must be friendly fire. And when they realize it's the enemy surrounding them, they have to quickly determine what they're going to do. Now, Lieutenant Melcher is with 17 other men. They quickly confer, and keep in mind that Melcher himself was about 19 or 20 years old at the time. Many of the men aren't much older. These are very young men who have to make quick decisions under intense pressure. And this was the solution that Melcher described. He wrote later, "What I said to these men was, 'Now, my men, as for myself, I had rather die in the attempt to cut our way out than be captured to rot in rebel prisons. Will you stand by me in this attempt?' This was a moment that tried men's souls, and boys too, but the resolution was quickly formed, and every one said, 'Yes, Lieutenant, we will, and gladly too.' I said, 'Every man load his rifle, fix bayonets, and follow me.' And with Sergeant Smith at my side, we started to cut our way out to liberty or death. Forming our line of battle, 17 men beside myself, in single rank, of course, we approached quietly and unobserved, as the Johnnies were all intent on watching for the Yanks in their front, not for a moment having a suspicion that they were to be attacked from the rear, until we were within 10 or 15 paces, when, on the first intimation that we were discovered, every one of our little band picked his man and fired, and with a great shout, as much as if we were 1,000, we rushed at them and onto them, sword and bayonets being our weapons. 'Surrender or die' was our battle cry." And of course, there are other accounts similar to these that emerge, but as you can imagine, there were some units that did not make that decision. Some of them surrendered to the enemy. Some of them weren't given the option. They were simply fired upon. But many of these men became panicked in the confusion and chaos of the wilderness. It's not surprising that when men recounted years after this event what this area was like, they described it as a region of gloom and death and a jungle of switch. Not the most pleasant place to fight. As Eric said, fighting in the open fields was kind of the preferable thing. These fields were magnets, but once they found themselves caught in the thickets of the wilderness, many of these units became confused, and this was true for men on both sides. General Bartlett himself, during the melee, as his line is collapsing on the right, there's a kind of domino effect going on as Ayer's brigade is being outflanked on the right, and that effect is coming across the turnpike. Bartlett, too, will find himself separated from his men, separated from his staff officers. And in another very colorful story that comes from this side of the battlefield, Bartlett, who's on his horse, tries to gallop back across the field. When the Confederates see him, some Virginians shout at him, ordering him to surrender, and he shakes his fist at them in defiance. And then he tries to madly gallop back here across the southern end of Saunder's field. Well, he doesn't make it. He gets his horse shot out from under him, and the horse does a somersault a few times before landing on top of its rider. And of course, this grabs the attention of men on both sides, watching this general somersaulting on his horse. And the Confederates let out this cheer because they're positive that surely Bartlett must be dead. There's no way somebody could survive having this beast fall on top of him. And then they see, you can imagine this in a movie, I'm sure, Bartlett sort of climbing his way out from under the horse, shakily trying to pull himself out. And there are 2 wounded Union soldiers nearby, and they help him out, and they pull him to safety on the other side of Saunders Field. So his story does have, I guess you could say, a happy ending. He's able to make it back to the other side of Saunders Field, but many Union troops were not quite as lucky. Now we're standing in a gully, and there are some stories that emerge from the fighting in these gullies as well. At the beginning of the tour, one of the things I asked you to consider is the landscape features, particularly how you can suddenly find yourself out of the line of sight of someone on top of that crest. And this was something that several soldiers write about in their memoirs and their regimental histories. There is one soldier from the 21st Virginia named John Worsham who left behind a memoir describing an encounter that he was not involved in but that he witnessed. And he writes, "Running midway across this little field was a gully," and possibly he's referring to the one that we're standing in right now, that had been washed by the rains. "In the retreat, many of the enemy went into this gully for protection from our fire. When we advanced to it, we ordered them out and to the rear. All came out except one, who had hidden under an overhanging bank and was overlooked. When we fell back across the field, the Yankees who followed us to the edge of the woods shot at us as we crossed. One of our men, thinking the fire was too warm, dropped into the gully for protection. Now there was a Yankee and a Confederate in the gully, and each was ignorant of the presence of the other. After a while, they commenced to move about in the gully, there being no danger so long as they did not show themselves. Soon they came in view of each other, and they commenced to banter. Then they decided that they would go into the road and have a regular fist and skull fight, the best man to have the other as his prisoner. While both sides were firing, the 2 men came into the road about midway between the lines of battle and in full view of both sides around the field. They surely created a commotion because both sides ceased firing. When the 2 men took off their coats and commenced to fight with their fists, a yell went up along each line, and men rushed to the edge of the opening for a better view. The Johnny soon had the Yank down, the Yank surrendered, and both quietly rolled into the gully. Here they remained until nightfall, when the Johnny brought the Yankee into our line. In the meantime, the disappearance of the 2 men into the gully was the signal for the resumption of firing. Such is war." So one of the more amusing stories to emerge from this gully. Now, despite heavy losses that were being incurred by the Federals as they retreat back across this field on mid-afternoon of May 5th, they are going to send in reserve units. And it's going to be Colonel Jacob Schweitzer, whose 9th Massachusetts Regiment will be sent in towards the very end of this first day of battle. The troops feel taunted because one of the stories, and I think Eric may have shared this a bit earlier, was there are some Alabamians and some North Carolinians who are arguing over a couple of captured Union cannon just on the other side of the road. And they apparently placed some Confederate flags on the cannon, and that's enough to taunt some of these Union troops. So with a great cry, men under Jacob Schweitzer surge forward, and they immediately take very heavy fire. And within moments, 12 officers and 138 men from this unit are shot down. They retreat back to the edge of the woods, and they're about to be sent in again. Schweitzer is ordering them back when, as one man later wrote, much to our relief, orders came from Griffin that the fighting would not continue. Schweitzer initially is very upset about this, but then when he realizes what the casualty rate is, he's actually very grateful that Griffin intervened at that moment. Otherwise, of course, the 9th Massachusetts would have sustained much, much heavier casualties. We're going to be heading up the field just behind you, right in front of you and just behind me for our final tour stop, and see you up there.
Question.
Explained Bartlett's brigade on this side of the road had met some initial success. and it managed to pierce John Jones' line when he went down and his command fell into disorganization. Some of the Bartlett's brigade had pushed on down the road, eventually being thrown back by Confederate reinforcements, pushed back across the field. On the north side of the field, Romaine Ayres' brigade. The 140th New York had gone in first with the U.S. regulars off to the northwest. The second line had come in with the 146th New York trying to plug the hole in the front line, and then the Pennsylvania regiments going up to help the regulars. If you look at your map, you can see, based on that, that the Confederate line did extend for quite a distance off to the north through the woods. Right here on the turnpike, and there was one regiment on the south side of the turnpike. The rest of the brigade off to the north was a mixture of North Carolinians and Virginians, commanded by a fellow named Stewart, George Stewart. Off to his north was Stafford's Louisianans, and then James Walker's Stonewall Brigade off to the extreme north. So you have one brigade, Union Brigade, coming across. You've got three brigades essentially extending across their front. So the Confederates greatly outdistanced the northern flank of this attack. And so the U.S. regulars and the Pennsylvanians off in the woods to the northwest were dealing with this tremendous pressure, both in front as well as wrapping around the right end or the right flank of their position, to the extent that the Confederates were actually not only in their front on the right end of their line, but they were spilling into the field behind them. And so, in order not to be captured in whole, the Pennsylvanians and the U.S. regulars drift back across the field. And that leaves simply the two New York regiments by themselves on the north side. Once Bartlett's brigade has withdrawn, that leaves only the 140th and 146th New York left on this side. They did not know what was going on. They were in the woods. They were down in front of the Confederate trenches. They're fighting for survival. They're not necessarily paying attention to what's in their rear until suddenly they start taking fire from the rear. Confederates who had pushed back the northern regiments of Ayres' brigade were now sweeping in behind them. One New Yorker said that not only were they flanked, they were doubly flanked. They had Confederates coming from this side once Bartlett's brigade had been repulsed and thrown back out, wrapping around them. So they weren't only flanked, they were doubly flanked, and they said we were in a bag and the string was pulled. So at this point, the New Yorkers, realizing they are on their own, look back across this field, and as you look behind you, imagine having to cross this field with the Confederates on both sides of the road firing back across. It literally is running the gauntlet of fire to get back across. Some of those New Yorkers talked about rushing down, jumping behind into the ravine. There were dead battery horses, artillery horses from Winslow's battery, diving behind the horses for protection, then jumping up and sprinting across the field. Anything they can do to make their way across this field to safety. So Griffin's division, his attack had been repulsed entirely once the two New York regiments withdrew from the north side of the field. As Andy mentioned, the guns, Winslow's battery, out here in the road, the Confederates were taking aim at the horses. If you kill the horses, you can't get the guns off the field. And so capture the guns, very important. Not only take them out of action, but you can use them yourself. So they the Confederates are shooting down the horses so that Winslow's battery couldn't get out. Winslow are shooting the horses so they can't get out. The men are going to be, all the artillerymen are either killed or they make their way out. And as Andy mentioned, there are two abandoned guns sitting in the middle of the road. For the Confederates, a tremendous tempting target, a prize. The first ones out to reach it, to reach the guns, was the 1st North Carolina Infantry. And they come rushing down the hill from this side, jump on the guns, claim them as their own. While they're doing so, they attract the attention of Federals on the other side of the the woods who have made it that far to safety, who fire into them, and that chases them off of the guns and into the gully. And as Andy said, the Alabamians then arrive, and they jump on them, claim them as their own. So at this point, there's a conflict between the North Carolinians and the Alabamians as to who owns the guns. Needless to say, both sides, both regiments eventually are forced to abandon the guns. Confederates come out later that night and retrieved them. But the Union has reestablished itself on the far side of the field. They've been beaten back, but that's where they're staying. They're not withdrawing all the way back to Wilderness Tavern or Elwood. They've pulled back into the safety of the far side of the field. Griffin's 3rd Brigade under Jacob Schweitzer had not made the attack. He established the line inside the woods upon which the defeated and repulsed attack could rally. Off to the south, the Federal divisions that Warren had sent in, his other divisions, they'd also been repulsed, trying to fight through the woods in the madness of the wilderness, and they were also on their way back. Griffin was frustrated because as his men came back and his brigades came back, and the firing here had settled down in the field, the Union 6th Corps appears in the woods off to the north. He had been delaying, he had been trying to keep this attack from occurring until the 6th Corps had appeared and protected him. His brigade heirs had been badly beaten up because the Confederate line extended beyond his, and now the 6th Corps arrives. Ayres, Griffin, extremely frustrated. The 146th New York. Let's start with the 140th New York as they came across with the 2 regiments. That is their monument that's in the field over there. The 140th New York, the first into the woods for Ayres' brigade, lost 254 men out of 556, 45%. This is a battle that took 90 minutes. Essentially, the amount of time we have now spent in this field is how long the fighting took in the fight at Saunders Field at 1 o'clock on May 5th, 1864. And in that time period, the 146th New York lost 45% of its men. The 140th New York lost 45%. The 146th lost 268 of 529. So they lost close to 50%. So a tremendous loss for both regiments in that very brief, short amount of time. Griffin, as I said earlier, he was a West Point grad. He was outspoken, very opinionated. His men loved him, and he was livid. His attack that he had not wanted to make, the attack that he had requested be delayed until his flanks were protected, until he was sure he had support, had been destroyed. His attack had been repulsed. He stormed into Union Army headquarters off near Wilderness Tavern, near Elwood, and he confronted Meade and Grant. Now this is a division commander, and he storms in and loudly denounced the attack, saying he had driven through Ewell's line, the Confederate line, which he had. Portions of the 20th Maine had pierced the Confederate line and moved down the road. He said he had driven through Ewell's line, but he got no support. There was nobody on his flank, there was nobody coming behind him, and he implied censure on the 6th Corps and implied fault on his corps commander, Warren. So Griffin was extremely upset. He's a career military officer, he's a West Point grad, and there he is standing in front of the commander of the Union Army and in George Meade and Grant, and he's very upset and voicing his opinion about his own commander, Gouverneur Warren. General John Rawlins, who was one of Grant's staff officers, was angered by what he viewed as Griffin's insubordination, and he wanted Griffin arrested on the spot. Grant was apparently also appalled. Grant, in fact, questioned, "Who is this General Gregg? You ought to arrest him." To which George Meade stepped up, and according to the lone account of this encounter, Meade began to button up Grant's jacket and looking down at him said, "It's Griffin, not Gregg, and it's only his way of talking." So Meade standing up for his division commander. But if this exchange did happen, it shows a little bit about this relationship between Meade and Grant and how it's developing. Meade is the Army commander, but it's at this point here in Saunders Field, the Union repulse, Grant's frustration that Warren had not made the attack earlier as had been ordered, and the delays and the excuses from this point forward, Grant really is going to begin to take a much more hands-on approach with the Army of the Potomac. Not necessarily that he doesn't believe that Meade can do the job or that Meade needs to be watched over, but Grant is a battlefield commander. So for him to sit back and wait and watch and just issue the orders is a little difficult. Not to mention, he certainly probably feels that the Army of the Potomac needs a little encouragement going into battle. But Grant is going to, this aggressiveness, this constant contact that begins here at Saunders Field. It was a fight that took 90 minutes. It failed, as Griffin and others had predicted. But for Grant, it's a mere setback. Remember, Grant's in, all chips are in. He's in this for the long haul. One attack in 90 minutes